Stakeholder theory is an idea about how business really works. It says that for any business to be successful, it has to create value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and financiers, shareholders, banks, and others, the people with the money. It says that you can't look at any one of those stakes, or stakeholders, if you like, in isolation. Their interest has to go together. And the job of a manager or an entrepreneur is to figure out how the interests of customers, suppliers, communities, employees, and financiers go in the same direction. Now, think about how important each of these groups is for a business to be successful. Think about a business that's lost its edge with its customers, that has products and services that its customers don't want as much, or that they don't want at all. That's a business in decline. Think about a business who manages suppliers in a way that the suppliers don't make them better. The suppliers just take orders and sell stuff, but the suppliers aren't trying to make a business more innovative, more creative. That's a business that's in a holding pattern and probably in decline. Think about a business whose employees don't want to be there every day, who aren't using 100% of their effort and their energy and their creativity to make the business better. That's a business in decline. Think about a business that's not a good citizen in the community, that routinely ignores or violates local custom and law, that doesn't pay attention to the quality of life in the community, doesn't pay attention to issues of corporate responsibility, of sustainability, of its effects on civil society. That's a business that's soon to be regulated into decline. And think about a business that doesn't create value, doesn't create profits for its financiers, its shareholders, banks, and others. That's a business in decline. So stakeholder theory is the idea that each one of these groups is important to the success of a business, and figuring out where their interests go in the same direction is what the managerial task and the entrepreneurial task is all about. Stakeholder theory says if you just focus on financiers, you miss what makes capitalism tick. What makes capitalism tick is that shareholders and financiers, customers, suppliers, employees, communities can together create something that no one of them can create alone. I've defined stakeholders as any group or individual that can affect or be affected by a company's purpose. Now, that definition is sometimes controversial. Some people say it lets everybody in because, after all, can't activist groups, web-based NGOs, a small group on the other side of the world, can't they affect a company? And the answer to that is yes. There's some truth in this criticism. That's a very wide definition of stakeholders. It comes from the idea that stakeholder theory is about business. It's about strategy. And it says if a group can affect you, then you need to deal with it. Well, another way to think about stakeholders is just to define them as those groups that can almost always affect or be affected by. So you start from the idea that if you look at practice, if you look at a lot of businesses over time and in lots of settings, really it's customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money, financiers. That those are the primary or definitional stakeholders. And other stakeholders, government, media, NGOs, interest groups, environmentalists, critics, however you want to put those groups are important because they can affect how you create value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money. I don't think definitions are very important. I think what's important is understanding how the value creation process works in a business. And in business A, in the automobile industry in India, the value creation process may be different than in business B, a web-based startup in Silicon Valley. So the point of stakeholder theory is to say, let's try and understand who those groups are that are important to the value creation process. We have this idea in business that, you know, when you tell somebody you teach business ethics, they say, well, that's an oxymoron. Two words, you put them together, they're a contradiction. And business and ethics just don't go together. If you start thinking about stakeholders, you have to re-examine that idea, because stakeholders turn out to be not products, not accounts, not assets, not liabilities. They turn out to be living, breathing human beings. And because stakeholders are living, breathing human beings, they're not just some role, they're actual people. It's not customers, it's customers with names and faces. And you don't just provide them with products. Your products and services come with a promise. Once you begin to think about stakeholders, the language of ethics kind of creeps in. And in a way, this is intentional, because the point of stakeholder theory, or managing for stakeholders as I like to call it, is that it's a way to think about business that puts business and ethics together. Business ethics shouldn't be an oxymoron. It should be two words that are redundant to each other. When we think about business, we ought to think about, well, what are the effects of this business on those that are outside it? Customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money. Thinking about stakeholders is thinking about business, and thinking about stakeholders is thinking about ethics. It comes to the same thing. So that's why it's important to think about stakeholders having names and faces and families, because they're human beings just like you and I. If we treat them as faceless entities, as roles, as assets, as receivers of products and services, we miss the fundamentally human connection that capitalism allows us to provide. You can differentiate different levels of stakeholders, in my mind, by simply asking both managers and stakeholders who's important. Managers don't have much problem understanding who can affect them and who they can affect. And stakeholders don't have much problem when you talk to them saying, well, I can't have much effect here, but I can over here. And so you can think about lots of ways to differentiate these stakeholders based on any sort of marketing segmentation strategy that goes on. So you could think about customers, segment customers by age and other demographic variables. But you could think about legislators in the same way, or you could think about communities in the same way. So all of the tools of marketing segmentation can be brought to bear to differentiate stakeholders. The problem, of course, is that how you differentiate stakeholders depends on what your value creation model is. And so if you divide them up the wrong way, so you divide stakeholders up for political purposes, and you don't understand the basic underlying economics of things, then you're liable to make mistakes. Alternatively, if you divide stakeholders up into, well, these groups are dealing with the social impact of products, and these groups are dealing with only the economic impact of products, then you're liable to miss the interaction between those two. So I like to not spend a lot of time saying, well, these are primary stakeholders, these are secondary stakeholders. I like to rely on real managers and stakeholders to do that for us. In stakeholder theory, we need more cases of real companies and real stakeholders interacting with each other. The business cases that we have are written from too much of the point of view of the way business schools see things, rather than the way that managers and stakeholders see things. Managing for stakeholders approach says that value creation works because we find the intersection of the interest of customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and financiers, shareholders and other people who put up their money. It's not that these interests don't sometimes conflict. It's that at the core, their interests have to go in the same direction. You got to have products and services that customers want. And somehow the fact that customers want those products and services has to translate back into your relationship with suppliers. Those products and services have to have good effects on the community or allow customers to do things in the community that they couldn't do otherwise. And they have to be related to what your employees want to do, the kind of knowledge that they have, etc. And the outcome of all that is going to be you're going to make money. So it's finding the intersection of those interests that is the interesting part of the value creation process. Stakeholder theory has for the longest time been seen as how do you sort out the conflicts among stakeholders. And I think that the managing for stakeholders approach says, well, you have to do that, but first and foremost you have to see how those interests go in the same direction. We're used to finding trade-offs. How do we trade off the interest of customers with the interest of shareholders? How do we trade off this contract with suppliers with this deal with employees? And stakeholder theory has for a long time been seen as the art of making those trade-offs. I want to reorient that. I think stakeholder theory is the art of not making trade-offs, of finding how the interests of these groups go in the same direction rather than in different directions. One thing I'm pretty sure of, if you look for trade-offs, you're going to find trade-offs. If you look to see how these interests go in the same direction, you might not find it. But I'm certain you won't find it if you don't look. I heard a CEO tell a story some years ago about his company. It was a chemical company, and they'd been written up as a very environmentally unfriendly company, and the CEO really wanted to change that. So he announces that the company is going to stand for zero pollution. And he goes around making speeches at the company facilities saying we're going to have zero pollution, we're going to work towards it. In fact, they're still working towards it. There's some interim targets, but we're serious about this, you've got to meet the targets. And as he told the story, at one facility the engineers told him, look, we just can't meet these targets. This process is too dirty and this plant equipment's too old. So the CEO says, well, okay, we're going to have to close the plant. We're serious about environmental stuff, and if that's the trade-off, we'll make it. So the engineers go away, and he told the story. They came back some weeks later, and they were kind of sheepish, and they said, well, kind of miracle. We figured out how to do it. And the CEO said, well, what's it going to cost? And they said, well, we're embarrassed to say we're going to save money if we do this. Right? They wouldn't accept the trade-off. They found the way to satisfy the interest of community and the interest around the environment and the interest of employees in the same. And if they hadn't looked for that, if they'd accepted the trade-off, they wouldn't have found that. What we found in case after case after case is that when you look for how these interests can go in the same direction, that's what you're able to create something. You're able to use your own ingenuity and creativity to create value. And that is what makes the managing for stakeholders approach really work. Value creation works because we're able to take the needs of customers that might conflict with community and figure out how to turn those into a profitable enterprise. Nowhere is this clearer than on the environment, where we take the idea that the price of oil is high, gas mileage becomes important, and we create engines that pollute less, that work for customers as well. So it's finding the intersection of those interests by looking on the fringe, by looking at what critics are saying, by looking at issues that you don't usually look at. That's where the value creation opportunities really are. One of the biggest myths of the last 25 years is that if you pay attention to stakeholders, it comes at the expense of shareholders. And I really think that this idea that it's stakeholders versus shareholders is one of the worst ideas of the last quarter century. How do you create? Suppose you're an absolute, dyed-in-the-wool, completely 100% genuine shareholder value person. You think business is just about creating value for shareholders. That's the only legitimate thing for business to do, and business has a moral obligation to create value for shareholders. Let's suppose you believe that. I want to be clear, I don't believe that, but suppose you do believe that. How do you create value for shareholders? Well, you start with great products and services that customers want. You have suppliers who want to make you better. You have employees who show up and want to give their energy to your company every day. You're a good citizen in the community, or the community will regulate you. And if you do all those things, you're going to make money for shareholders. So even if you're the most ardent shareholder value advocate in the world, you got to manage for stakeholders. Now, once you start that process, you quickly see you create even more value for shareholders if you try to find how these stakeholder interests go in the same direction. So there's absolutely no trade-off here between shareholders and the other stakeholders. Shareholders are stakeholders, for Pete's sake. And if you try to make those trade-offs, if you try to trade off shareholder interest, let's say, with customer interest, in the business world of the 21st century, you're going to make mistakes. There's too much complexity, there's too much uncertainty, and you can't make those trade-offs. You can't make them with the precision that people think. Oh, the stock might go up a penny or two, or you might find some hits on the stock, but you can't sustain that by making trade-offs. And so you have to see the interest of shareholders and the interest of the other stakeholders as going in the same direction. It's not shareholders versus stakeholders. Stakeholder theory is just a better way to think about business, because it's about creating a lot of value for shareholders and creating a lot of value for the other stakeholders as well. Those things have to go in the same direction. In lots of places, we see this debate as between Milton Friedman, who's seen as the advocate of maximizing profits for shareholders, and stakeholder theorists, who are seen as thinking about take care of stakeholders. And so this Friedman, sometimes it's me versus Freeman debate, gets posed in all the business ethics textbooks and classrooms, etc. I actually think if Milton Friedman were alive today, I think he'd be a stakeholder theorist. I think he would understand that the only way to create value for shareholders in today's world is to pay attention to customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and shareholders at the same time. What Friedman was against was the idea of social responsibility doesn't have anything to do with business. I'm against that too. I think stakeholder theory is a theory about business, but community and civil society is absolutely central to business. We need corporate stakeholder responsibility. If we have that, there's no conflict between shareholders and stakeholders. In much of stakeholder theory, we see stakeholders primarily around large companies. And so there's this idea that the large public company, there's this debate between shareholders and stakeholders. Well, I think if you actually think about the value creation idea, that capitalism is about creating value for stakeholders, really focusing on large publicly traded Western corporations is a mistake. How does any business work? It doesn't matter if you're a family company or a one-person firm. You're trying to have some products that customers want. Eventually, you either make all this stuff yourself or you have suppliers. Eventually, you got to hire employees. Eventually, you matter in the community that you're in. You might matter as soon as you hire someone. You might matter when you build a plant. And so, at different points in the evolution of your business, different stakeholders will be important. So let's take a small business, for instance, that's funded by a venture capitalist. Well, that entrepreneur has to pay a lot of attention to the venture capitalist. And the entrepreneur may have to find one or two lead customers to pay attention to as they're developing the initial product. As the company grows, oftentimes what happens is they begin to have a problem with a supplier. They've just bought stuff, and now they have to find a steady source of supply. So I've got to pay attention to the supplier. But I still have to pay attention to the venture capitalist and the customer. And now at some point I've got to add in employees, at some point I've got to add in community. So the attention that various stakeholders need ebbs and flows over time with the cycles of a business. But there's no real difference between a small business and a large business. Well, there is one difference. In a small business, if you don't manage for stakeholders every day, I don't think you're around for very long. Large companies are basically harder to kill. And so you can ignore some stakeholders for a while, and it'll take a while for that process to catch up with you. But catch up with you it will. Companies have to start in managing for stakeholders, not ironically with stakeholders. They have to start by thinking about their purpose. They have to start by asking the question, why are we here? What are we trying to do? What do we stand for? What kind of company do we want to be? Which stakeholders do we want to create value for? What's our underlying value creation model? Now, I've observed a number of kinds of purpose, or as I like to call this, enterprise strategy. A strategy for the enterprise as a whole. And then we can talk about stakeholder by stakeholder. But if you think about enterprise as a whole, one strategy might be to pick 2 or 3 stakeholders and really try to create value for those. Many companies have what I would call an employee shareholder customer strategy. What they try to do is they try to have employees who are really pumped up about the company, who want to be there, who provide great service for customers, and this in turn creates value for shareholders. Right? Those kinds of companies, again, that's a sustainable strategy over time, as long as you don't make mistakes with community, as long as you don't make mistakes with suppliers. They're always there, but they don't have to be in the forefront. And so you see company after company saying, well, taking care of employees is important, so if I take care of employees, they'll take care of my customers, and I'll create value for shareholders. The interest of employees, customers, and shareholders going in the same direction here. A lot of those companies don't talk very much about community, don't talk very much about suppliers, but they manage those relationships in a different way, but not a bad way. Other companies say, no, our job is to balance or harmonize. Is what I like better because I'm a musician. So I like the idea that we're going to harmonize the interest of these stakeholders. They all might be playing different notes, but the notes are going to go together in the same way. And they see, how do we get customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and people with the money going in the same direction? And that's the sort of basic idea behind creating value for stakeholders. The narrow stakeholder enterprise strategy works. But the sort of basic 5 strategy works too. There's a third strategy that I've seen, a third approach to enterprise strategy that I've seen that's very interesting. And these are companies that I've called noble cause companies. They're companies who have a purpose, and the purpose is around really making the world a better place. Doing something that makes a real difference in the world. Now, we can have lots of debates about what these are. I mean, some people might think acting from the left makes the world a better place. Some might think acting from the right makes the world a better place. We can have conversations about that. But these companies are trying to make a difference in the world. It's Novo Nordisk trying to make a difference around diabetes. It's Merck and their famous case of making a difference around river blindness, where Merck would say medicines for people, not for profits. It might be companies like Whole Foods and Patagonia. And there are lots of others that are around. Simply, maybe they've come from entrepreneurs with a vision. Maybe they've come from some history of trying to make a difference in the world. But strategy for stakeholders starts with this idea of purpose. Either trying to create value for a narrow group of stakeholders, trying to create value for a broad group of stakeholders, or trying to have some purpose where values are at the center. And they can be almost any kind of values, it turns out. Once we have that, now we can say, well, this will help us understand what our business model is. And now I can think about how I deal with customers, or how I deal with employees particularly, or how I deal with suppliers. So it's enterprise first, trying to find this integrated way of thinking about stakeholders, and then specific stakeholder strategies that come after that. There's a moment today, more than any I've seen in the past 30 years, where we can change the story of business. The story of business and the story of capitalism has been business is a bunch of greedy little bastards out trying to do each other in. And capitalism works because nature's red in tooth and claw, and people are out there trying to outcompete each other. The managing stakeholders idea is that's completely wrong and inappropriate, and it's a bad narrative to go forward. Even if it did describe industrial capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th century, it's a bad idea. It's a story that really debases and disrespects human beings and our ideas about how we work together to create value for each other. The good news is that there's a moment today to change that, in part because of all the scandals, in part because of globalization, in part because the old idea of capitalism is just broken down and really is no longer useful. So what I see all over the world is I see people worried about social responsibility. I see them worried about civil society. I see them worried about the environment and sustainability. I see them worried about making their companies a great place to work. I see them worried about something called social entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs trying to create value to make the world better. All of these ideas have to come together in the center of what capitalism is. That's what stakeholder idea is about. That's what stakeholder theory is. It says business creates value in a responsible way that takes care of the environment, that tries to make the world a better place, that engages employees, and it makes money for shareholders. Those things have to go in the same direction. The idea that business and ethics and sustainability and responsibility are separate is an idea whose time has passed. We've got to put these things at the center of our story about capitalism. And there's a lot of work to be done. I can say this in grand terms, but the real work to be done is company by company and discipline by discipline and story by story that we have to do. Now, sometime in the late 70s, we were writing a working paper about the stakeholder approach. We were sort of developing our version of it. And we sent it to a journal to be listed as a working paper. We weren't trying to publish it in the journal, just to be listed. The editor calls it, I think the title of the paper was Stakeholder Management. And the editor calls and says, hey, we got your paper, we'll list it, but there's a horrible typo in the title. It says Stakeholder Management. We know you mean Stockholder Management, but don't worry, we'll change it. So in a relatively few short years, that was roughly 30 years ago, in a few short years, the stakeholder idea has become not only part of our language, but a kind of controversial part of our language. That's a good thing, because it means it's already there. People are already thinking about, well, who's got a stake in this business? Some people argue, well, you know, it's a simple common sense idea. Other people argue as well, it's this radical idea. Other people argue, well, we've been doing this all along. And that's a good conversation to have. that says we put at the center of our way of thinking about capitalism who's got a stake in this business, how does this business create value for them, how does it do so in a responsible and sustainable way. People have argued around whether stakeholder theory itself provides enough guidance to run a business in an ethical way, or does it need something else? This is a problem that theorists have called the so-called normative justification problem of stakeholder theory. Now, my reaction to this is, well, it depends on what you think stakeholder theory is. If you think it's an alternative to shareholder theory, so there's a shareholder theory of the firm, and then there's a stakeholder theory of the firm, maybe you need, and so they're to be juxtaposed against each other. And just as we can put shareholder theory in supposedly purely economic terms, we can put stakeholder theory of the firm in purely economic terms. And we play those off against each other, and hey, where's the ethics here? It's just, economists arguing over who's most important. Now, I don't see stakeholder theory this way. I don't have much at stake as what's a theory and what's not. I think the stakeholder theory, as I say it, or framework or idea, is just a really good idea about what makes business work. Embedded in that is once you frame things as creating value for stakeholders, I've framed it as creating value for other human beings who have names and faces and children. So I'm doing ethics. Now, one way to say this is that stakeholder theory is a genre. There are lots of stakeholder theories. There are lots of ways to run a business and to run it ethically. One of the things I've learned over the years is there isn't one and only one way to create value in an ethical way. Part of the problem is our policymakers and our theorists try to find the one and only one way to run a business ethically. Usually it's their way, but leave that aside. I want to say stakeholder theory allows us to see the beautiful diversity of capitalism. And maybe there are obviously some unethical ways to run a business as well, but I want to start with the idea that there are lots of ways to run a business, be sustainable, be responsible, pay different levels of attention to different stakeholders. And what we need is an idea that's inclusive rather than one that's exclusive. In business ethics, people talk lots of times about saints, those who really kind of get it and run their businesses in an ethical way, and sinners. Sinners are businesses that really don't pay much attention to stakeholders, don't pay much attention to ethics, or are not as good as the saints. And you have this debate, you see it in business and in policy circles, between the saints and the sinners. And I don't think that debate's very interesting. The way I've started to say it as well, I think everybody's a cross-dresser. Everybody has a little bit of saint, everybody has a little bit of sinner, and what we need is a more robust way of understanding business so that we don't have to make it all saints or all sinners. The saints and sinners discussion is just another way of saying business and ethics don't mix with each other. And what we need is to entangle those ideas so much that what we see are, fine-grained ideas from companies that manage stakeholder relationships in a variety of different ways. So I don't think you need some normative justification of stakeholder theory. What you need is putting business and ethics together. You need ideas about business that's got human beings in it. And human beings are ethical creatures. And you need an idea about ethics that has value creation in it. Ethics is about human behavior, how we treat each other, and one of the things we do is we create value for each other. If you look at the academic literature, most of the business literature says nothing about ethics. And most of the ethics literature says nothing about business. We need ideas that put those things together. That is, I think, a very formidable problem with lots of work to be done. One of the most important forces for change in business has been the unparalleled increase in communications technology and information technology. The way I like to put it is, well, I'm sure we have more computing power and electronic equipment in this room than existed in the world 30 years ago. What that does is lend an immediacy to managing for stakeholders. There's nowhere to hide. Anything that a business does is almost instantaneously available on the news, a blog, a YouTube video of it, an email, anywhere in the world. And so time is compressed. One of the ways I could justify trade-offs in the past was, well, I'll trade off customers here, but then over time I'll kind of make that up. And you don't have that time anymore. So any trade-off you make is instantaneously winner-loser. You don't have time to make it up because everybody knows. And so, ironically, it's made it much harder for businesses to operate in the old model. You have to be completely engaged with your stakeholders 24/7, 365 if you're a business today. Because if you're not, they're going to be engaged in a way that ultimately is not going to be to your benefit. So I think the communication technology and the information technology has given an immediacy to managing for stakeholders which just didn't exist 30 years ago. One question is, if managing for stakeholders is such a powerful and simple idea, why aren't more people doing it? My answer to that question is, well, they are. It depends on when you start to look. What people do, how you see that, depends on the frame that you bring to it. If what you want to find is people making trade-offs for shareholders, because that's the dominant metaphor, the dominant narrative, the dominant story that we tell about business, then we'll go out and enact that story. We'll make it true. We train managers in business school, we train a generation of managers to make trade-offs of shareholders versus others. And they're going out doing it. The theory matters. What we have to do is change the theory. We change the narrative. And then we make it easy for people to create value for stakeholders. They're doing it anyway, but they're doing it in spite of the background narrative of business only counts for the people with the money. We need to make the background narrative consistent with what I think good practice is. And at the same time, more and more companies around the world are adopting a managing for stakeholders approach. 30 years ago, you could rarely find the word. Now you find it in many mission statements from India to Cupertino, to Delaware, to Denmark, to South Africa, to China. I think it's ironic that a book I wrote in 1984 called Strategic Management, a Stakeholder Approach was last year translated into Chinese. Even though I'm told there's not a word for stakeholder in Chinese. There are very clear ideas about how important relationships are. So I think, in a way, this issue, if you see it as a battle between shareholders and stakeholders, who wins, I think you just simply declare victory. Business is about creating value for stakeholders, and some of them are shareholders. I'm always amused that I get a lot of credit for having developed the stakeholder idea, and I really didn't. I wrote a book in the early 1980s that tried to show who did develop the idea. As near as I could tell, it was developed at the Stanford Research Institute by a number of people as a way to categorize the business environment that was there. Then it got developed by people at Wharton, Russell Aikoff and Eric Trist, and in 1984 I wrote this book that just tried to catalog kind of where we were and what might happen if you began to take the idea seriously. Well, then a lot of people started to work on the idea, and so stakeholder theory today is a really multifaceted approach by literally hundreds of scholars who take pieces of the idea and develop it in lots of different ways. I think what's one of the things that's interesting about that, I thought that the stakeholder idea was primarily an idea about business strategy. But the people who really took this idea up and developed it were people in ethics and people who did corporate social responsibility. Today it's been kind of rediscovered in business strategy, and I think that's probably a good thing. But what has been missing for 30 years is the sense of integration. The sense that managing for stakeholders is about what business is and what capitalism is. And yeah, it's about strategy. And yes, it's about ethics. And yes, it's about corporate responsibility. And yes, it's about civil society. But it's mostly about all of that and how you put those things together and literally tell a new story about capitalism. Capitalism is about how we create value for stakeholders. What makes capitalism work is our desire to create value for each other, not our desire to compete. Capitalism is the greatest system of social collaboration we've ever invented. Competition's important, but it's a second-order property. It's about collaboration. It's about how we cooperate together to create value for each other. So the history of the stakeholder idea is, I think, a history of trying to understand the business environment and make sense of it, to making sense of it in a way that says, you know, we really have to rethink the basics of what capitalism can be. There are lots of places to start to think about managing for stakeholders. You could start with a particular stakeholder and say, wait a minute, I want to understand how my employees see their place in the value creation process. Or you might say, I want to understand what the value creation process is for customers and how that affects the value creation process for employees. So you could start at that level of saying, let me pick on a particular stakeholder and see how they are connected with the others so that I can build out an understanding of what the value creation process is. You start at another level. You could start at the level that says, I want to understand why a particular critic is saying what they're saying about me. So you pick a specific stakeholder and you try and really get inside that stakeholder's head. Try and understand what the critic is telling you about your value creation process. Every critic has something to say about the value creation process. You can't respond to them all, but if you could respond to them, you'd have new products and services ideas. New products and services ideas come from engaging the critics. So you can start with the idea of what's our value creation process. You can start with the idea of who are the critics and what does that say about the value creation process. Or you start at a different place. Put yourself in the middle and say, what's my purpose? Who are those individuals and groups that can affect what I'm doing? Can I understand how I create value and how the value I create is connected to the value that my company creates? So you could start at that value creation level. You can start at a particular stakeholder level, like critics, or you put yourself in the middle and think about how you create value. Those are three starting points for beginning to think about managing for stakeholders. One of the problems that we have in our society is that this narrative about capitalism being about greedy people and competition, and only the money counts, has led to an erosion of public trust. And capitalism, business needs public trust and understanding to exist. Not because it goes against that, but because business creates social goods and social bads. It's a part of society. And when society distrusts business, there's a big disconnect here. Now, one way to rebuild public trust is to try to lobby for, different laws and regulations and those kinds of things. And that needs to be done. I'm not opposed to people doing that. But another way to build public trust is to rebuild it stakeholder by stakeholder. So, for instance, would you distrust a company whose products and services that you used? And would you distrust that company if they manage their supplier relationships really well, if their employees were engaged and wanted to be there, if they were good citizens in the community, and if they made money for shareholders? Would you still distrust them? I think the answer to that's no, you wouldn't distrust them. A reasonable person wouldn't. Now, if companies do that, and so we build trust stakeholder by stakeholder in a broad range of companies, big and small. But suppose we found that public trust still wasn't very high. What would we conclude? I would conclude that the background story, the story about what people expect from business, is that they're greedy little bastards out trying to do each other in, and that's what needs to be changed. Change the background story, create robust, sustainable relationships with stakeholders, and I believe public trust will emerge from that. And I don't think there's any shortcut to that. If the public distrusts business, who do they trust? In the U.S., it's not government. It's less so media. I don't know about educational institutions. I'll continue to believe that trust is high there, though perhaps it should and shouldn't be. And people trust institutions that mediate between them and business. So they trust institutions that give them information that they perceive businesses won't give them. In today's world, it's what Europeans would call civil society. It's NGOs. It's groups that literally aren't customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and financiers, but it's groups that affect those. It's maybe it's Greenpeace, maybe it's the Environmental Defense Fund, maybe it's a public interest group on nutrition information. Those groups have built trust in a kind of direct way with their constituents. And so one of the challenges for business is how do they respond to those groups, how do they deal with those groups, the way I like to call it, how they engage those stakeholders on an ongoing basis so that they can rebuild, so that they can build trust with those. A very famous case back in the 1990s, McDonald's engaged with the Environmental Defense Fund around issues of packaging. And because the Environmental Defense Fund had some environmental knowledge that at that time McDonald's didn't have, they created a tremendous amount of value in terms of recycling and packaging, etc. The Environmental Defense Fund has gone on to work with lots of different companies to try and do that. The process is the same. It's engaging stakeholders to create value. When that happens, trust emerges. It's not something that you could have an advertising campaign to build public trust. You've got to engage stakeholder by stakeholder, issue by issue. And there are lots of companies out doing that now.